Hello, welcome, those who are listening/watching, Incarnation Read. As you know, this is not normally the kind of way it goes, but since we're between seasons right now, I was wanting to get some interesting other related content. And today we have, in my humble opinion, what is quite possibly the most interesting horror writer currently writing in the modern day, Mr. Brian Evenson. Brian, how are you doing today?
Good, thanks very much. I'm happy to be here.
We are very much happy to have you. So, as those who recognize Brian's name will probably know that he has a book coming out later in August, entitled The Glassy Burning Floor of Hell. And I have myself a fancy-dancy little galley reader's copy right here. For starters, I think I'll just go ahead and say that I thought your previous book, some of you may also know this one, Song for the Unraveling of the World, thought that one had won the award for most depressingly apocalyptic book title. But you've really upped the ante with The Glassy Burning Floor of Hell. You've upped your game there. So I'm very impressed on that front.
I think they definitely both have a kind of post-apocalyptic end of the world feel to them. So I'm glad to hear that I'm getting more depressing as I go.
always ideal for writers of that style. So yes, this new book is coming out. It sounds like, based just on the context of the way this past year has kind of gone, it seems like it was written in the midst of a lot of global turmoil, to put it lightly. Is that, I guess that's fair to say?
Well, I mean, it's funny because the book was actually pretty much done before the pandemic started.
Oh, really?
And so I think it was actually, I think I turned it in maybe March or maybe April of last year, so there were at least kind of hints that things were getting really bad. But it was before things got super, super bad. And so I think that was on the horizon. But most of them have been written in 2018, 2019, a few earlier than that even.
I see. That is eerily predictive, I suppose.
Yeah. I wish it wasn't as predictive as it turned out to be. Yeah.
Don't we all? Speaking of stories that were published hitherto the publication of this book, the first one I had actually come into contact with was the opening story, Leg. I read it in Tiny Nightmares, which was that, as you know, that little collection of short horror stories, I believe, that came out on Halloween, last Halloween.
I think that's right, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm curious, Leg. From the get-go, I could tell it was I was like, if I didn't know this was Brian Evenson, I would have from the first couple sentences, because it's just very treats the human body in an interesting way. And I'm curious. I know you get probably asked this question a lot of like where your ideas come from, but I am curious to know why Leg? Why specifically did you think of how a leg would act independently of its owner?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I'm not exactly sure where it came, but I really like this idea of, the idea of a part of something kind of acting in a way that's different from the whole, or the idea of a prosthesis being something that's alive and maybe more than it seems to be. And so it really started with that, just thinking about this notion of this creature that is almost parasitic, that both is there as a kind of help to this person, and also at the same time seems to be using that as a way to get other sorts of things that it wants. And so that I think was interesting to me, just thinking about the way in which humans interact with things that aren't necessarily human. And also, I mean, it is kind of a story of someone who's selling their soul and, making these choices with this demon or whatever you want to call it. I mean, it's a creature. It's hard to know what it is exactly, who is obliging her in what she wants. And it ends up taking things in a very strange direction.
It's interesting you use the words selling one's soul, because that kind of, I won't say religious, but I suppose, yeah, pseudo-religious imagery almost reminds me of the Tower from Song for the Unraveling, in a similar way, kind of mirroring an old story style in a very apocalyptic, or I guess, post-apocalyptic context.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's something. I was someone who was raised in a religion. I'm excommunicated now, excommunicated Mormon, but it's certainly something that really structured the way I thought about the world. And I do think, I mean, this notion of responsibility and I think that the leg is there almost as this temptation, and this force or this power that's manipulating the character, as well as allowing itself to be a friend or be used. And so those lines between to what degree is this someone who's my servant? To what degree is this someone who's manipulating me? To what degree is this something that's really taken advantage of me? Those lines become very tricky, I think, in some ways.
I see, yeah. And speaking of I suppose, I guess post-apocalypticism, another story that stuck out to me was as distinctly kind of, I guess, what one might say relevant to the present day, was The Nameless Citizen. Yeah, a very long, or not long, but long for your stories, with a lot of yours lasting just a couple pages, but that one, it really brought the reader, at least brought me on a bit of a journey, and certainly not one without pain.
No.
And I'm curious to know, it strikes me also as a post-human kind of story, and I'm curious to know what kind of inspirations went into that.
Yeah, a lot of these stories in this book seem to be about post-humanism or the end of humanity in some way or another. But so that story, I have a novel which is called Immobility, and I see that story as very much tied to that. It's not exactly a sequel to it. It's more like adjacent to it, so kind of a semi semi-sequel, I suppose. I don't know quite how to describe it. But both that, Nameless Citizen, and another novella I wrote called The Warren, seem to me to be operating in not identical worlds, but kind of adjacent worlds. And just thinking about, what's the relationship of someone to the society they live in, but also to the world as at large. And in that case, of course, you have someone who seems to be transformed in some ways and is being called upon by these people who haven't been transformed, but may have been created through different means, and him making decisions about what to do about it or what not to do about it.
I see. Yeah, I've once, when asked to describe your writing to folks, it's not as been difficult, but it's been interesting to see their reactions, I think, because people aren't really used to writers that both ride the genre line and also have a unifying style. You've got a lot of examples, I think, of writers who, I suppose, are able to write in a lot of different genres, are able to write in a lot of different styles, but it doesn't feel like there's anything holding it together. But I do not, I feel like there is always something kind of holding your stuff together. And you work in sci-fi quite a bit. And I think there's certainly a role. I guess, what role do you think genre plays there?
Well, so I feel like, I work in sci-fi, I work in horror. I often work in those two things together. Sometimes more generally fantastical writing, sometimes more realistic writing or crime-related writing. But I think that there's something in terms of just the mood of the pieces or the style that holds them together. There's a kind of, a way in which the language is being used as well. But more than anything, I just think that there's a kind of general relation to the world and the strangeness, that kind of the basic weirdness that holds things together, I suppose. But yeah, I do like to think that if you pick up a story of mine, you'll recognize it as a Brian Evenson story, that it seems like a story that I'd be most likely to write.
I see. Another story that caught my attention, partially because of the mythology it plays off of, was Myling Comer. One of the earlier stories in the book, but certainly one of the more scarier stories, in my opinion. It almost struck me as kind of Legati-esque. I'm curious, what about the mythology of the Myling sort of spoke to you? And I suppose you can kind of sum it up for those who might not be familiar.
Yeah, I mean, I have several stories kind of in different books that kind of play off Scandinavian mythology in some way or another. And this one, the Myling is this kind of creature that has been buried at the crossroads. It's an unborn baby or an abandoned baby who's left at the crossroads. There's different ways of reading it, and depending on what legend you're working with, it really depends. But the idea basically is that a baby who's been abandoned by their mother at the crossroads and left to die. And they kind of end up coming back as something that haunts and that wants to kind of get on people's backs. That doesn't come up in my story so much, but there's a sense of them riding people and taking them to the graveyard and being so heavy that when people are walking with them on their backs, they kind of slowly sink down into the earth of the graveyard. And so I had this, it was a really different sort of strange mythology than anything I knew, and I got asked to do something for an anthology that was going to be kind of folklore-y. And I'd had this idea for a while, and I remembered things. My great grandmother was Norwegian, and when she was kind of near the end of her life, she kind of reverted to speaking mainly Norwegian. And I don't know Norwegian, I can't follow her, but I remember visiting her and her trying to communicate, and also just having lost her English. And it kind of, just my memory of that experience kind of came together with this strange Scandinavian monster, if you want to call it a monster, and kind of allowed me to kind of explore the story in a way that hopefully is pretty creepy and a little bit frightening.
Your hope succeeded, my friend.
Good.
But yeah, it was interesting because I had never really read anything of yours that had taken a folk horror route. Admittedly, there's probably just stuff I haven't read, but
I don't think there's much, to be honest. Yeah.
I see. So somebody that is familiar with your books, but in particular your short story collections, will know that your short story collections, although they are different stories, they have a thematic through line, and there is kind of a reason they're all, I suppose, collected in the same thing. They may not tell a literal story, but they do kind of tell an emotional story. At least that's my perception of it.
I think that's a good way to look at it.
And I'm curious, what again, without giving too much away, if you don't want to, what would you say is sort of the emotional through line of the Glassy Burning Floor of Hell?
Well, that's that's hard to say. I mean, I think there's a kind of bleakness. There's a sense of what is our relationship to the world, and what are we doing to the world, and what's potentially left there. There's a lot more kind of stories with an ecological bent in this book than in previous books, I think. That's not the exclusive thing by any means. There's a kind of focus on post-humanism, which I think it kind of ties into that. And then I think generally, I think there's a focus on what it means to be part of a community or to refuse to be part of a community. And so, there's several stories in which people are kind of called upon to be part of a group and kind of refuse to do it in various ways. So I guess those would be the things. I mean, there may be other things that you've seen that are more relevant or more, that struck you more than those things.
That's possible. I mean, I don't know. I think that's what makes a book rereadable. Is like you can kind of keep coming back to it and getting something new. I'm curious.
When I was writing it, I think the idea was that all the stories would be talking to one another, so that you'd see something in one story that would kind of be responding to something in another story, or an idea in one story would come up that would kind of recirculate into another story. And that kind of notion of ideas kind of being discussed and moving, and themes being discussed and moving, I think was pretty important to the book.
I see. So speaking of your short story collections, one of your more popular collections was A Collapse of Horses. And I've heard you say that the title story came from an actual experience that happened to you about horses laying down. Am I correct?
Yeah. So the title story started because it was when my wife now and I were dating, and she was living in San Francisco, and we were walking through Golden Gate Park, and in the middle of Golden Gate Park, there's a horse paddock, which I hadn't realized till we were walking through. And we just happened to come across this little horse paddock on a day when all the horses were lying down. There were maybe 3 or 4, not very many horses. But it was really strange to me because I'd never actually, despite living, growing up in the West, and despite having kind of been around, at least a little bit around horses growing up, I'd never seen horses lying down before. And initially, as we kind of approached this from a distance, I couldn't tell if they were moving. It seemed like they weren't moving. And so there was this very weird moment where I just kept on worrying about the horses and kind of feeling like I was approaching this horse slaughter or something, and got closer and closer, and as I did, it wasn't until we were quite close that one of the horses kind of flicked its tail, and I realized, oh, it's lying down, it's okay. And I went away from that and just kept thinking about that, and kept thinking about this moment of not knowing if they were alive or if they were dead, and just the strangeness of being in that space. and then that kind of became the generative engine for the story. And since then I've talked to people who have owned horses, and they're like, oh yeah, they lay down all the time. It's not a big deal. But just the fact that I didn't know put me in this position where, I had this very strange experience, and that ended up, I think, really, generating the story.
Yeah, that's interesting. Those are the images that stick with you.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Did your wife, or I guess at the time girlfriend, did she happen to know, like, this is going to be a story or anything like that?
She knew me well enough. I think she knew that I was responding to this in a very particular way. So I don't think she knew exactly where it was going to go, but she wasn't surprised at all. And in fact, she's a writer too. She writes young adult literature, and also children's books, and really different sort of writer than I am. Her books are kind of much more cheery than mine are. But when she's been out and talking about things, she often talks about that experience and thinking about, we have this experience together. It's an experience that I would never think to use, but it's something that my husband, like, immediately, he ended up kind of turning it over in his head and working on it, and it became something. And I think that's part of it too, is you just, different sorts of writers are drawn to different sorts of things, and it's being kind of attuned to those moments that are going to be sympathetic to your goals and your style, is really kind of one way of kind of interacting with the world in a way that kind of makes fiction that's productive.
I see. Does your wife write with a pen name, or does she write under her normal name?
No, she writes under her own name. Kristen Tracy's her name, and she's done a bunch of young adult novels that mainly have female characters in them. Main characters are female. And then has also has two picture books that are just coming out too, and several other books that are kind of in the works.
I see. Well, hey, those interested in young adult and or picture books, go check out Kristen Tracy.
Yeah,
we'll do whole lots of exposure in this interview.
Thank you.
So, were there any stories in the Glassy Burning Floor of Hell that came from any similarly, I guess, odd or sort of just stick in your brain type life experiences, or any funny stories?
Well, I think there were moments that in all in all my books, I think there are moments where a story kind of started from an unexpected moment or something happening. I'm trying to think of specifically with Glassy Burning Floor if there's a story that really was that way, and it's more often it's just there's like little moments or little bits of things. So, for instance, the story I was just talking about, Myling Comer, was, it really did partly come from not only my interest in the Myling, but also in just my memories of this kind of time with my great-grandmother, kind of as she was approaching her own death. And so it's really, things like that, just little things that you can kind of grab a hold of that start to take you different ways. And I'd say there's lots of little moments that I only probably would recognize as coming from life in my stories, but that are definitely there. So I guess the one that would be the most that way would be Hospice, which is a story, very short piece I wrote, which is about someone who finds themselves incapable of drawing their breath, which also feels very weird now that we've had the pandemic. And in fact, this is probably the oldest story in this particular collection. But I had, maybe 10 years ago, I had a weird lung collapse and had this experience of kind of collapsing in the hospital. So a lot of the details are about that. And even though I think a lot of the kind of specific details about the relationship are not, just the little details about just the experience, I think, are derived from that.
Interesting. I'm sorry to hear you went through that experience, because it was described quite difficultly.
Yeah, I think that it's described quite difficultly because I could, because I lived through that, and so it ends up. And there's something for me very weirdly palliative about being able to put it into language and in a way take it out of myself by just kind of translating into this thing on the page. So, but yeah, there's lots of little moments. Like there's in the Glassy Burning Floor of Hell, there's a particular hotel room described, which has, the very strange kind of thing where the toilet's part of the room. And that's based on a room that I actually was in a foreign country at one point. Things like that all kind of circle around.
Wow. Where was it?
That was actually in France, but it was years ago, and it was in a very small town. And so it was the kind of thing where, if you're in a small town out of the middle of nowhere and you haven't bothered to make hotel reservations, you take what you can take. So, but it's weird because I would say that title story, the hotel that's described in that, is a kind of amalgam of maybe 5 or 6 different places that I've stayed in. And so I'm taking bits and pieces of the world as I know it and kind of bringing them together to make something that hopefully generates a certain kind of mood or affect.
I see. To sort of, take a step back and look at some of your earlier works. So this particular book, I'm sure you recognize, Altman's Tongue. And those who are fans of Brian may know that this book that I'm currently holding in my hand was Brian's first novel to come out with Knopf. His first novel ever is what I mean by that. And it was also the first book I read by you. And I was curious because I noticed a very distinct shift between the days of Altman's Tongue, what I refer to as your tough as nails work, and to your current stuff. I think your earlier stuff, I've noticed it has a bit of a unique kind of obscurity and intensity to it. Many of the stories in Altman's Tongue are incredibly, incredibly short, just, a page or so. And I'm curious to know the ideas in the days of Altman's Tongue and in the days of Celestial Birds. I'm curious, how do you feel looking back on your past work in comparison to your current work? Do you notice a difference? Do you notice much of a shift?
Yeah. Well, I definitely notice a difference, and it's interesting. The Den of Celestial Birds it was published after Altman's Tongue, but the stories were mainly written before Altman's Tongue. And that one, there's a kind of more almost magic realist style to it. There's a kind of different sort of shape to the stories. And then Altman's Tongue is, I would say, probably my most severe book. The stories are very stripped down. And there was so much of that book as an effort to do as much as I possibly can with as little as I possibly can. And so a lot of the stories are fairly shocking and fairly abrupt. And then I think after writing that, and part of that was due, I was working with an editor at the time named Gordon Lish, and he really encouraged that kind of style. A lot of the stories were originally published in a magazine he had called The Quarterly. And I think I was partly writing as a way of because I knew that was somewhere that would publish me. But there are stories in that, like the Sansa Affair, which is a fairly late story, which starts to get more expansive and is starting to play around with the crime genre in a particular way, and a few other pieces that are kind of starting to get longer. And then I feel like, as I've kind of, I like those stories. I'm pretty happy with that book. There's some of those stories in there I'm very, very happy with. But kind of as I've moved forward in time, I've become more interested in kind of expanding a little bit, seeing how much I can do, allowing a little more emotion into the stories, allowing something else to start to happen. And so yeah, I don't know. It's funny because I sometimes meet people and they'll talk about how their favorite book is Altman's Tongue, and that's great. I like that it is, but I do feel like the work since then has started to go in a little different direction, more genre conscious. I feel like there's always a little aspect of that in my work, even in that first book. But I feel like it's be something that's become more and more central to my work as I've continued to develop. So
I see. How do you feel about the novels that were reprinted by Coffee House in 2016? In 2016.
So yeah, it was 4 books that were, how many were reprinted? 3 were reprinted, I guess. So there's Father of Lies, there's The Open Curtain, there's That's When Collapse of Horses was issued, and there's Last Days. Of those, probably the one I like the best is Last Days. I like the way it is kind of a riff on a noir. It's a very, very dark book, but I also think it's a very funny book, and it's really crazy. So it was really, really fun to write. Right now I'm working on a sequel to that, which is going to be called Phantom Limb. And I'm about 100 pages into that. So
that's some bombshell news right there. Phantom Limb, man, that sounds really good. Last Days. I see what you mean with the simultaneous dark and comedy to it, kind of resulting in this very surreal atmosphere. What made you want to write a sequel?
Well, I liked that book, and that book originally started. The first section of that book was its own kind of chapbook, and I published it kind of individually. And then when I finished that, I thought, there's more of this story to be told, and so I ended up kind of writing the second, basically the last 2/3 of it, and making it as its own book, Last Days. But I just, I think the last words of that book are "Where now? What next?" and or something very close to that. And I just kept on thinking about, I just kept on having these ideas for where he might go after this, or what might happen to the main character after this. And so yeah, and exploring that, and it's gotten very strange, and so what you would expect from the first book, but it's strange in a slightly different way. So we'll see where it goes.
Well, that is very interesting and exciting, I will say. Those watching in the visual format, if not, you're just going to have to imagine it. But Last Days, this is Last Days right here, published by Coffee House in 16. You're looking at it backwards, sorry. But go give it a read, because apparently we're about to get a continuation. Anyhow, to take it back to Altman's Tongue, one more question I had about it.
Sure.
So this is something you've spoken publicly about before, something that is in a sense notorious. Altman's Tongue was met by pretty heavy objection from the Mormon Church. And it's interesting because I read these in the jacket of there, and it says something along the lines of, Brian Evenson writes incredibly dark things, but something you might not expect is that he's a very devout Mormon, because this, I guess, was the original publication of it. And there are stories in that book that depict religion in a very either critical or sort of dark and surreal way. The Blank, that whole trilogy of stories, I think, is a good example of that, but also a few others in there, the titles of which are currently escaping my head, of course. But so I'm curious.
Also usually in a fantastical way, so there's no sense that it's like depicting Mormonism per se or anything like that. Yeah. I mean, it was for whatever reason, Knopf, when they published the book, they wanted to use that language on the book jacket, and I objected to it because I just thought it was likely to cause me problems. But it just happened. It went out anyway. It was like I objected, and they said, "Oh, it's already gone to press." And I don't know that it really had. I think that the editor of the book was probably, he wanted his way. He's kind of a notorious guy. And then that ended up causing me a fair amount of problems, partly because, basically what happened, I was at Brigham Young. I was teaching there as a faculty member. When I was hired at Brigham Young, I was really frank with them about the kind of writing I was doing, and asked them if it was going to be an issue. And, the other faculty who were on the hiring committee said, well, is there any sex in it? I said, well, not really. And they said, oh, well, it'll be fine then. If it's only violence, it's okay. And which seemed weird to me, but I was like, okay, well, they probably know. What happened was I was actually taking another teacher's class, and he asked me to come in while he was out of town and talk a little bit about my book. And I did that and read a few stories, and there just happened to be someone in the class who was very conservative Mormon, who had relatives who had connections to Mormon general authorities, who were the people who were kind of at the top of the Mormon Church. And she read the book and ended up writing a letter to them and saying how evil the book was, and the general authorities sent the letter back to my department chair, and they called me in and demanded that I defend the book. And I didn't know who the student was. I didn't have any of that information, and it felt weird to me to be writing in response to an anonymous letter, but I did that. And wrote about why I was doing what I did, why I felt like it was something that was valid to do, and why it was important. And eventually, I just didn't hear anything. So eventually I asked my department chair, and he said, oh, yeah, I sent that stuff to the people who sent the letter, And I had a cover letter, showed me the cover letter, and it said something like, in short, Brian Evenson understands that what he did was wrong and that further publications like it will bring repercussions. And, at the time I was like, I actually thought I was defending my work. And that's my thing I was doing here. And there was no talk of further repercussions or anything like that. And I don't have any intention to not do the work I want to do. So I need to, so I had a long kind of back and forth with them in which they mainly just stonewalled me and refused to answer, asking what, if they were basically telling me that I would be fired if I published the work I wanted to do. And eventually I got enough of a yes that I decided to leave and go elsewhere. And that was kind of, it was basically, and it became a very big controversy in Utah, which also was complicated in various ways. But that was really the start of my leaving the Mormon Church. And, it took me another 5 or 6 years to kind of separate completely from it. But I really started to feel like if I wanted to, what I was finding was that at a certain point I was doing too much in reaction to Mormonism, and that to get a sense of who I wanted to be and kind of what my ethical demeanor was actually really was, I needed to just have a separation from it. And so eventually they kept on calling me in and trying to control what I wrote. And eventually I just said, let's move forward with excommunication. And at that point they were like, wait. We don't need to do that. Pray with me. And but by that point, it was like it became clear to me it was partly a control mechanism to keep me in the Mormon Church. So I ended up petitioning for excommunication, had my records removed, and at the time I thought that was going to be terrifying, just because I'd grown up Mormon. My family went 6 generations back with Mormonism, and so we really had this long history with it. But in the end, it was a very positive thing. I feel very happy to be free of religion at this point. So, and I think you can be outside of religion and still be a very ethical person. So,
well, mad respect. I mean, that's some important questions to answer. And I'm curious. Undoubtedly, some of the stories in Altman's Tongue were written, probably a while before its publication. But I'm curious, when writing those stories that maybe sort of approached the territory of organized religion a little bit more, did you feel they kind of like clashed with your worldview? Did they kind of feel a little disconnected from what you believed on a spiritual level, or was it more natural than that?
Well, I mean, I think it was a little more natural than that. I mean, I think I'd always been interested in dark fiction, and part of the reason I was interested in it, I mean, I think that you can discuss very dark things without condoning them. And so, I mean, I think it's partly that. And there, I think I kind of began from this space in Mormonism. One of the Mormon church leaders, a guy named Brigham Young, said at one point that everything is worthy of study, everything on earth and everything in heaven and everything in hell. And I just took that very seriously, the idea that, you should think very seriously about just every aspect of what's possible, and explored that. So I didn't really see it as a contradiction. I mean, I think with that book in particular, I mean, I think it really did come out of my Mormon upbringing, partly because, the thing I was saying before about the book, when I was a kid growing up in Utah, the same thing would happen with R-rated movies, where officially, as a Mormon, you weren't supposed to go see R-rated movies. But people would always say, my peers would say, oh, it's okay to go see it as long as there's not, sex in it, or there's not, you're not seeing nudity. As if somehow it was more okay to see people killed on screen than it was to see a body.
That's a very American idea, I think.
Yeah. Well, I always thought it was really weird. It is definitely an American thing, and it's not exclusive to Mormonism. But that made me think a little bit about, just the way in which people were kind of desensitized to violence, and I think one of the things I was trying to do kind of thematically with Altman's Tongue when I was writing it was to resensitize people to violence. And I think it is it's an intense and difficult book in a lot of ways. So, but it's also like, as I said, there's not really that much that's connected directly to Mormonism in the book. There's almost nothing. And it's not till, later I wrote a book called Father of Lies, which is pretty a direct critique of religion. And not Mormonism per se, but I mean, there's certainly connections, and so yeah.
Interesting, yeah. That's yeah.
I was still part of the Mormon Church too when I wrote that, and I that was probably a sign I was on my way out.
The sign near the end, huh? Speaking of books that sort of that are directly related to Mormonism, there's also this lovely one right here, The Open Curtain. My personal favorite by you. And this story... But really this story and a lot of your stories, I sort of find this in Last Days, I sort of found this a little bit in Father of Lies, and even to a degree in Leg. There's a motif I find where... And even in some of the stories in Altman's Tongues, like Killing Cats... The motif of a character sort of being sort of coerced or maybe misled and manipulated or eventually coaxed into committing violence seems to be a recurring thing in The Open Curtain. You have the dynamic between Rudd and Lael. Father of Lies, you have sort of between Fox and his brain. With Last Days, Klein and the entire cult. And I'm just curious, this continually recurring motif, where does it sort of originate?
I mean, that probably does come from Mormonism, to be honest.
Interesting.
Just because there's so much emphasis put on choice and being responsible for your choices. But yeah, I mean, that is something that comes up again and again. These ideas of these people who allow themselves, I guess is how I'd phrase it, to be coaxed to doing things that they shouldn't do, and end up kind of through slow steps, kind of moving into darker and darker spaces. So something like Last Days, it's like he's on a path that he doesn't realize how dark that path's going to get until it's really gone very, very far. And then once he's on it, his momentum is such that he doesn't feel like he can step off of it, even though he feels at the same time like it's making him less and less human. And Open Curtain is actually another of my next to Last Days and Open Curtain are probably my two favorite novels I've done. And the thing about that book is it's set very much in Utah that I grew up in. There's any kind of details that are connected to the place that I think make it very, very vivid. And it's so much about what is it like to grow up in a particular culture, and especially if you're someone who's struggling or damaged in various ways. And obviously, Rudd's damage is pretty severe, but I still think I try to deal with him at least relatively sympathetically. So, and with Lindy as well. So it is like in that book. I mean, I think so much is about what's happening to send him on the path that he's going on, and is there any way to stop it? And I don't know if I have any answers to it, but I'm interested in just that path and where it's going. Yeah, for sure. To lighten things up a little bit, I am curious. You have a number of how many children do you have? I have three children.
I promise that's related. That wasn't just a random question.
Oh, okay. That's all right. You can ask even if it's not related.
Just don't want to come out of the blue with that.
Right.
But I heard from a previous interview with you that you have children of varying ages. You have older kids and then you have sort of younger kids. I'm curious, do any of them, but I guess in particular the older kids, do they read your work? Have they ever read anything by you?
They do. My oldest child, Sarah, who's they're non-binary, live up in Minneapolis. They designed the covers for the coffee house books. And so they're a visual artist and do a lot of graphic design, and they do read the books. And Valerie, my daughter, also has read them. My son Max, who's like 8. Valerie she's born in 91, so is a little bit older, and Sarah's slightly younger than that. They both can have read them and kind of can make sense of them, and I think enjoy them at least to some degree. But Max, no, he's not. I don't feel like, I think he needs to be at least like 15 before he reads them.
Yeah, hasn't crossed the age line, perhaps.
That's right. Yeah.
I'm glad you brought up the covers, because I had a bit of a revelation while looking at these books recently. Those familiar with the Coffee House reprint will know that the 4 books, Father of Lies, Last Days, Open Curtain, and A Collapse of Horses, if you put the books together in a quartet, they form a beast, sort of an image, a collective image.
Right.
However, and I have not heard anybody else sort of spot this, so I felt very special myself when I figured it out. But the books then published after that, or one of them about to be published, so I'm juggling like 18 different tomes right now. We've got the collection of The Glassy Burning Floor of Hell, and then Song for the Unraveling of the World, both done in the same visual style. But these do form patterns with the original books. If you put Song for the Unraveling World next to Open Curtain, I found something there, Father of Lies and Glassy Burning Floor of Hell, as well as Glassy Burning Floor being put next to the Open Curtain. And this blew my mind a little bit, and so I'm curious to know what's going on there.
Well, I think when we did the original 4 books, we had this concept of all the books kind of, adding up to form one picture of a kind of beast. And then, when we published Song for the Unraveling of the World, we thought a little bit about it, and Coffee House and Sarah and I just thought, what if we just do like a replacement head? So it's like you have this beast with replaceable parts. And so you have a head that can kind of substitute for the head that's, in the original 4, and then Glassy Burning Floor substitutes for another quadrant of the beast. And I don't know if we'll keep on going in that direction with future books. We may or may not. I think Sarah's getting a little tired of just doing parts of a beast, and they're very talented, so I think they could do some really amazing things with the covers. But it has been nice to think of the cover concept itself as something that's kind of communicating. And I don't really think I've seen other covers that have done that so much. There's covers that kind of similarly tone in terms of color and things like that, but the idea of kind of using multiple colors to kind of form an image and then reform it with different covers is I think pretty unique.
Yeah, no doubt. It took me by quite a surprise upon discovering it, but it's very interesting. I'm just picturing like an 80-book display of like all the different ones assembled in a variety of ways. Probably won't go that far.
Yeah, I mean, so there's several different combinations you can do now, and obviously as you add more, there's all sorts. So, but you're not the only one. I mean, I've heard people who, there's been plenty of people where I've shown that at a reading, and they've like gasped because they didn't realize that the books they had actually fit together.
That's funny. Another question that you may have gotten before. Your character names are very unique. Selections. We've got names like Borchert, Klein, Paya, Trolle. My personal favorite, Raffendus, which took a bit of pronouncing on my part.
Right.
Where do these names come from? Why select these specifically often Slavic names?
I think partly because there's something about those names, Slavic names and Germanic names have kind of hard sounds to them. And so for me, there's a particular mood that goes with those names, a very different kind of sound than, French names or Italian names or even a lot of just common American names. And there's also like something for me, a lot of those names have a kind of like affect to them. I mean, Hecla, I think it's discussed in one of the stories, has a particular meaning that goes with the name. And that's something I can kind of play with. While I'm putting the story together, and then I think the other thing is they kind of work almost as an indication, where they kind of let you know you're entering into a space which is strange and not the same as the normal world. I would imagine if you're actually from Scandinavia, it wouldn't feel that way exactly, but even then, I think that there's enough kind of strange names that make sense. So.
And how about the name Altman? This is a name that appears multiple times under multiple characters in Ullman's tongue, but also appears, I believe, in Dead Space Martyr, correct?
It does, yeah.
Yeah, what's the meaning there?
Yeah. I don't know, for some, that's a name. Altman is a name that I keep returning to for some reason. And it's not that it's always the same character. It's just that there's like a kind of, family resemblance between those characters. And it's a name that I just have kept on returning to. And in fact, with Dead Space Martyr, I mean, the tricky thing with that was very strange is I had, Altman's Tongue, I had that name. And then when the video game for Dead Space came out, there was a character named Michael Altman in it. And when they asked me if I would, if I wanted to write something, write a novel based on Dead Space, that was the first thing that occurred to me. I'd played the video game, so I kind of knew it a little bit. But it occurred to me that, this is who I should write about.
Interesting. So it was complete coincidence that Altman was in there.
That was a complete coincidence, but it was also like when I was writing that, I mean, they when you're writing contract novels like that, they usually have you kind of put together a proposal in terms of how you do it. And so I put together this proposal, and in the proposal, it's supposed to be a few pages, it ended up being like 10 or 20 pages. But I ended up suggesting or proposing a kind of dramatic change in the lore of the story that you get in the video game, and had a way to kind of make it work so you could kind of understand, why the first video game had presented it this way and then how it had changed. And I thought, yeah, there's no way they'll let me get away with this. This is $1 million property. They've already invested a lot. And they came back and they're like, yeah, we love this. We'll go ahead with this. So it was very exciting to me that, they let me do Michael Altman in the way that I wanted to do it, and really kind of, that was just a really fun book to write. Partly, because I'd played the video game, and so when they asked me to do it, I kind of knew that, I had a sense of the feel. I knew that my style would probably work pretty well for it.
Nice. Speaking of contract novels, you wrote the novelization, I believe it was under B.K. Evenson, for the Rob Zombie film Lords of Salem.
Yes, yeah.
How did that connection happen? Did you happen to meet Rob Zombie personally, or what happened there?
Well, it was kind of this funny thing where I got approached by an agent who was interested in doing it, and just thought that my style would work well with Rob Zombie's, and then basically what happened. Obviously there's the movie that's Lords of Salem. He was working on the movie at the time. We didn't. I don't think we actually spoke face to face ever. We kind of communicated in other ways, and but he had a treatment that he sent me for the movie. Eventually, he sent me the script for the movie, and then I kind of just worked on it and developed a story that was very close to the script, in fact. And then what happened, kind of in the process of shooting the movie and cutting it, I think his first cut of the movie was something like 3.5 hours long or 4 hours long. And so suddenly he was compressing it to get it down to less than half of that length. And so it became a much more, a movie that kind of moved forward much more mysteriously and kind of very much was oriented around something, image rather than plot. And so, by the time the book was being published and the film was out, they felt really very different. And, I think the way we always saw it was that the book and the movie were meant to kind of work together. That a lot of the things that remain mysterious in the movie are explained in the book, and vice versa. So
I see. Interesting. Another such notable crossover between your work in cinema, the director Elias Mirhij, I think I'm pronouncing that right. He created a short film that didn't get a whole lot of release, I believe, entitled The Den of Celestial Birds, which notably is a title of a story by you and a collection by you. Were you involved in that at all? Was there a crossover there? Or?
No, I wasn't involved in that. I'm not sure if there was a crossover. I've actually communicated with him since then, but we've never discussed that book or that film in particular. It could be that there's a connection there, but I think that the place I got that title from, The Den of Celestial Birds, was from a philosopher named Alfonso Lingus, who used it to talk about stuff that was done, which is something that Freud talks about. But the person who, Daniel Paul Schraber, who wrote a book called Memoirs of My Nervous Illness, in which he explains why he is crazy, but he should be released from from being in prison. So that was kind of where I was coming from with the title, even though it's like a very different sort of book. And I've seen that. I actually like Merhige's film, but I can't tell for sure if it's connected.
Huh, that's interesting. Yeah, I've only seen Begotten by him, which I absolutely loved, and it scarred me permanently.
I think that's a good description of Begotten. Yeah,
something that could be said for many of the books currently sitting on my floor by yours truly, or you. Something I read in the back portion, the afterword of The Open Curtain, was that there was you had an idea for another novel to be set in a world, quote unquote, not unlike that of The Open Curtain, possibly some kind of semi-sequel or something like that. I've already had you announce the sequel to Last Days, so I was just curious to know if there's anything in the pipeline there.
That's something I actually have about 70 pages of notes and a kind of pretty detailed plot description of a piece that would take place in that same world, and that has, there's similarities and differences for sure, but there are definitely connections. And I think what happened, it was like I went to an artist colony and just worked up this whole kind of design for the book with a lot of kind of description of how it would work. And in a way, I was almost too specific about it. And so by the time I was done, I thought, well, I maybe I don't need to write the book now.
Oh.
So we'll see. I mean, I think that's a project that I see myself as potentially going back to once I forget a little bit more about, the way in which I might, approach it. But I think I'll get there eventually.
That's interesting. Yeah, I hear a lot of people talk about, like, me myself as a writer, I find I can't write too many notes about something because they say that you don't want to tell your story before you actually sit down to write the actual thing. Which I think is interesting.
Yeah, it is. And in fact, so basically, I ended up not too long ago kind of putting together a proposal for a TV show based on the notes I had for this kind of book. And maybe that, I don't know, it's so hard to ever get anything like that made, but that may be the direction it either ends up going, or just the act of doing that may end up taking me back into it in some way.
I see.
And taking me back into the novel in some way.
I see. That'd be interesting. Okay, we have covered a lot of territory, a lot of very interesting and deep and also often quite dark territory. To finish this review, I'm going to ask you a question that I believe is very important. Pancakes or waffles?
Pancakes.
Interesting. Why?
Well, there's such a variety of pancakes, and I'm very happy. So when I say pancakes, I'm including crepes. I'm including pancakes with blueberries, just everything like that. That really works for me.
That's a good point. Never thought about that. Well, there you have it, folks. Brian Evenson chooses pancakes.
So did you choose waffles?
I chose waffles.
I mean, I think that's okay. I mean, you can also do a lot with waffles, and you can put a lot on them.
That's true, and they can be crunchy, too, which I feel like is valuable versatility. And they got little syrup catchers in them, little grid-like syrup catchers.
One of the reasons I think I said pancakes, I mean, this is totally off the topic, and you can cut it if you want, is when I lived in Denver, there was this restaurant, which is a pancake restaurant, and they just had such a variety of pancakes from different nationalities, ranging from like the Dutch baby, which is amazing if you've never had that, to normal pancakes, to crepes, to kind of super thin Swedish pancakes. And so I think I'm naturally kind of prone to think of just a larger amount of variety with pancakes.
Let's see. What restaurant was this? I live in Boulder, actually, so I'm not far off.
It's there's one in Boulder too. It's the what's it called? I think it has pancake in the title.
That's a good start.
I'll try to figure it out, but it has like someone flipping a pancake. It used to have on the sign. So, but yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that necessarily is going to make it so that you change your ways in terms of your preferences, but it might. Yeah.
It's all about planting the seeds, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, or maybe it's not there anymore. I mean, it's been years since I lived there, so
yeah. Hopefully, the pandemic didn't wipe it out.
Meantime, so.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, those of you who have come to listen / watch this interview, thank you very much. If you are unfamiliar with Brian Evenson's work, get your life together and purchase one of his books or all of them, and just have at, and be warned it might take you to some dark places, but it will be worth it in the end. And those of you who are familiar with Brian Evenson but not familiar with me, my name is CSW, and I create a horror podcast by the name of Incarnation Read. Season 2 is set to debut this Halloween, and so hopefully y'all tune in for that. Hopefully y'all tune in for him, and thank you for tuning in for this.